Imagine standing on a street in a London suburb. It's 6:43 p.m., a September evening in 1944. People are returning from work. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. Life is proceeding as normal. The air smells of early autumn and coal smoke. Suddenly, darkness. There is no whistle of a falling bomb. No drone of bomber engines in the sky. No wail of the air raid siren. 1 second, the street exists. The next, in its place, lies a smoking crater 30 feet deep. Homes are reduced to debris. Trees are uprooted. And only seconds after the explosion comes the sound. A thunderclap, like the crack of a giant whip, tears through the silence. Survivors look up in terror at the sky. It is empty. A perfectly clear blue sky. This was not just a new kind of bombardment. On that day, September 8th, 1944, humanity entered a new era. An era where danger moves faster than the speed of sound. Londoners were used to the war. They had survived the Blitz, the night raids of the German Air Force. They had learned to take cover from the V-1, the buzz bombs that sounded like broken motorcycles. If the motor cut out, you had 10 seconds to dive for cover. It was terrifying, but it was understandable. You had a chance. But this new weapon gave no chances. It fell literally from space. This rocket climbed to an altitude of 50 miles, touching the edge of the atmosphere, and plunged toward its target at nearly 2,000 miles per hour. That is 3 times the speed of sound. You couldn't see it. You couldn't hear it. You couldn't shoot it down. By the time the sonic boom reached your ears, the impact had already happened. The regime called it Vergeltungswaffe 2, Retaliation Weapon 2, or simply the V2. For the leadership in Berlin, this was the last hope. A magic wand intended to turn the tide of a war Germany had effectively already lost. It was a miracle of engineering, a technological leap that was decades ahead of its time. Imagine someone building a Ferrari in the era of steam engines. That is what the V2 was in 1944. But today, we will not simply praise engineering feats, because the story of the V2 is not a success story. It is a story of a colossal, tragic, and ultimately futile failure. There is a myth that the German military machine worked like clockwork, that their wonder weapons were genius inventions that simply ran out of time. But the numbers tell a different story. This program cost the Third Reich approximately 2 billion Reichsmarks. To understand the scale, this is comparable to what the United States spent on the Manhattan Project, the creation of the atomic bomb. America received a weapon that ended the war and changed geopolitics for the next 50 years. Germany received a very large firework. If you combine all the explosives delivered by thousands of V-2 rockets over 7 months of attacks, the total equals the payload dropped by a conventional Allied bomber squadron in a single major raid. So why did they do it? Why did a country, whose army was freezing without winter uniforms and lacked fuel for tanks, pour its dwindling resources into a rocket that exploded on the launch pad more often than it hit its target? The answer to this question forces us to look at the Second World War from a new perspective. We are used to seeing the regime as calculated villains, but we rarely see them as irrational. Obsessed fanatics who believed in technological magic more than logic. Today, we will take this rocket apart, bolt by bolt. We will descend into the underground tunnels where forced laborers assembled spaceships for a dictator. We will see how a dream of reaching the stars turned into an instrument of terror. And we will answer the main question: how the most advanced weapon in history turned out to be the most useless piece of metal on the battlefield. But to understand how they reached this point of madness, we need to rewind time. Back to where this story began, not as a plan for destruction, but as a harmless dream of enthusiasts. Germany, the 1920s. The Weimar Republic. It is a strange time. On one hand, the humiliation following the First World War and hyperinflation. On the other, an incredible cultural explosion. And, a wild obsession with space. Long before American kids started wearing Buck Rogers helmets, Germany went crazy for rockets. They called it the Raketenrummel, the rocket rumble. It was like the modern startup boom. Amateurs gathered in empty lots, building strange tin contraptions and trying to launch them into the sky. Sometimes it worked. Often it ended in a cloud of smoke, startling local farmers. Engineers attached rocket motors to everything. Rocket cars, rocket sleds, even rocket bicycles. Newspapers went wild. People believed that very soon they would be having coffee on the moon. Among these dreamers was a young aristocrat with the looks of a movie star. Wernher von Braun, remember that name. For many Americans, he would become a hero, the man who gave the U.S. the moon. But in 1930, he was just an 18-year-old student who struggled with math until he realized he couldn't build a spaceship without it. Von Braun joined an amateur rocket club. By day they studied, and by night, in an abandoned warehouse, they welded metal and mixed dangerous chemicals, dreaming of Mars. It was romantic, pure science. But they weren't just being watched by enthusiastic journalists. Standing in the shadows were men in gray coats. The German army. There is a popular myth taught in history classes. It claims Germany turned to rockets only because the Treaty of Versailles forbade them from having heavy artillery, but said nothing about rockets. It's a convenient story, but it's not the whole truth. The military didn't care about legal loopholes. They wanted power. They saw the potential in rockets to replace cannons, to strike further than the eye could see. And they had money. A lot of money. The amateur rocketeers had no money. Their experiments were getting expensive, and sponsors were vanishing. And here, young von Braun faced a choice that would determine the fate of thousands. The Army offered him funding, unlimited resources, the best laboratories, materials the amateurs could only dream of. But there was one condition. Forget about flights to Mars. Forget about postal rockets or space tourism. You must build a weapon capable of delivering a ton of explosives onto the enemy. Von Braun agreed. Later, he would say he just wanted to build rockets, and where the money came from didn't matter, that he was an apolitical scientist. But the facts show that in 1932, he began working on the Army's secret project. And in January 1933, everything changed. Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. Democracy ended. Amateur rocket clubs were dissolved or absorbed by the state. Free creativity died. Now, von Braun was working for the regime. He quickly understood the rules of the game. Charismatic and brilliant, he became a favorite of the new power. They gave him everything. For testing, they allocated an entire peninsula on the Baltic Sea, Peenemünde. It was an engineer's dream, a top-secret city hidden in the forests. The best minds worked there. They were solving problems that seemed impossible. How do you stabilize a 12-ton cylinder flying at supersonic speeds? How do you make an engine run on a mix of alcohol and liquid oxygen without melting in a second? It was an incredible technical challenge, and they were succeeding. Step by step, explosion by explosion, they approached the creation of the A4, the rocket that would later be known as the V2. Von Braun talked about satellites, but the generals signing the checks looked at the blueprints and saw only one thing: perfectly delivered destruction. At the start of the war, the leadership ignored these toys. Their tanks were conquering Europe in weeks. Why spend millions on complex, unreliable rockets? But by 1942, luck had turned. The offensive stalled in Russia. America entered the war. German cities began to crumble under Allied bombers. The leadership needed a miracle. And so, the project was given top priority. Money flowed like water. But this technological fairy tale had a price. To build the rocket of the future, they decided to return to methods from the dark past. Building the V2 wasn't just difficult. It was an engineering nightmare. Imagine trying to build a Saturn V in the mid-40s using limited technology. The main problem was fuel. Liquid oxygen is a difficult substance. At minus 297 degrees Fahrenheit, it froze valves instantly. It made metal brittle as glass. The engineers at Peenemünde struggled for months. Rockets exploded on the pad. They fell back down. They broke apart in midair. Von Braun joked, "It takes 6 months to build a rocket and half a second to blow it up." But there was a bigger problem than oxygen. The rocket had no pilot. They needed to create a brain, an analog computer that could keep a 14-ton machine vertical at 3,500 miles per hour. They used gyroscopes, tiny graphite vanes placed directly into the roaring exhaust flame corrected the course. It was science fiction technology, and it was too big to hide. Across the channel, British intelligence began receiving strange reports. Spies spoke of flying cigars. Captured generals whispered in bugged cells. The British sent reconnaissance planes. On thousands of grainy photos, analysts searched for a needle in a haystack. And one day, they found it. On the Baltic coast, they saw strange shadows. Shadows of something tall, standing vertically. And next to them, circular scorch marks on the grass. Winston Churchill realized the threat was real. The reaction was immediate. Operation Hydra. On the night of August 17th, 1943, nearly 600 heavy bombers of the Royal Air Force took to the sky. Their target was not a city or a factory. Their target was science. For 45 minutes, they dropped nearly 2,000 tons of explosives on the research center. Laboratories were destroyed. Living quarters burned. More than 700 people died that night, including key engineers. Von Braun himself barely escaped to a bunker. The Allies believed they had set the rocket program back by years. They believed they had saved London. But they were wrong. The bombing of Peenemünde became a turning point, but not in the way the Allies planned. Instead of closing the project, the regime made a decision that would turn an engineering task into a crime against humanity. The SS leadership took control. They proposed moving production where no bomber could reach it, underground. In the Harz Mountains, in the center of Germany, there were old mining tunnels. They decided to expand them into the largest underground factory in the world. But who would dig the stone? Who would haul the concrete? The German workforce was at the front. The solution was cold and practical. Use prisoners from concentration camps. They were viewed as expendable. Thus, the Mittelwerk factory was born, a place where advanced space technology met medieval brutality. Imagine 2 giant tunnels inside a mountain, each a mile long. Between them, dozens of cross tunnels, like the rungs of a ladder. This is Mittelwerk, the darkest place on Earth in 1944. Thousands of prisoners were herded here. Russians, French, Poles, political dissidents. Their task was simple: hollow out the mountain and assemble rockets. The conditions were beyond harsh. There was no ventilation inside the mountain. The air was thick with stone dust that solidified in the lungs. The smell was unbearable. The temperature stayed constantly cold and damp. For the first few months, the prisoners didn't see the sun. They slept in the tunnels, in niches carved into the rock, right next to the drilling machines. Sanitation was non-existent. They worked 12 to 18 hours a day. If someone collapsed from exhaustion, the guards showed no mercy. And here lies the most horrifying contrast of this story. Amidst the dust and suffering stood pristine, shining rocket fuselages, the pinnacle of human genius. Engineers in white coats walked among the starving laborers, checking gyroscopes and fuel pumps. They demanded perfect precision, micron-level tolerances, complex electronics, all assembled by the hands of men who could barely stand. Von Braun visited this place. In his later memoirs, he claimed he didn't know the extent of the suffering, that he was too busy with science. But documents found later tell a different story. He visited Mittelwerk multiple times. He walked these tunnels. He signed requests for more labor. He knew. Everyone knew. The prisoners tried to resist in the only way they could: sabotage. It required incredible courage. If a defect was found, the punishment was severe and public. But they continued. They compromised the electrical wiring. They loosened screws deep inside the engine. They placed foreign objects in the fuel tanks. Many rockets that would later explode in mid-air or miss London were the result of this silent resistance. The human cost of this program is shocking. Approximately 60,000 people passed through the Dora Mittelbau camp. 1/3 of them, 20,000, perished. Let's pause on that number. 20,000 lives lost. Remember it. Because when we count how many people the rocket actually killed by exploding in enemy cities, you will understand the absurdity. The V-2 is a unique case in military history. It is a weapon that claimed more lives during its production than it did in combat. By the autumn of 1944, the production line was running at full capacity. Trains loaded with rockets emerged from the dark tunnels. The regime had its weapon. Now, all that remained was to push the button. The rockets were loaded onto mobile launchers and driven to the forests of the Netherlands. From there, it was only 200 miles to London. Flight time, 5 minutes. When we think of missile bases, we imagine huge concrete bunkers. The Germans initially built those too, but the Allies bombed them before the concrete could dry. So, the engineers devised a concept that remains the standard for missile forces today: mobility. Instead of fixed bases, they used special transporter trailers. A convoy would drive into a forest or a city intersection. In 90 minutes, soldiers would raise the rocket, fuel it, aim it, and launch. 5 minutes after liftoff, the convoy would vanish. It was shoot and scoot. Allied pilots hunting for launch sites were chasing ghosts. On September 8, 1944, the ghost struck London. The British government panicked. They didn't want to admit that the enemy had a weapon against which there was no defense. So, they officially claimed the explosions were caused by gas main leaks. But the explosions kept happening. People found strange metal fragments. The truth could not be hidden. The psychological effect was unique. During the Blitz, you heard the siren. You ran to the subway. There was a sense of shared experience. With the V-2, it was different. It was a lottery. You could be walking to the store, sleeping in your bed, or sitting in a pub, and simply cease to exist. Without warning, many Londoners became fatalists. "If my name is on it, there's nothing I can do," they said. But London wasn't the only target. We often forget that more rockets fell on the liberated port of Antwerp in Belgium than on England. Antwerp was vital for the U.S. Army supply lines. It was in Antwerp that the single most tragic event of the rocket campaign occurred. December 16th, 1944. The Rex Cinema. The theater was packed. About 1,000 people, locals, and hundreds of Allied soldiers on leave, were watching a movie. They were eating popcorn, laughing, forgetting the war for a few hours. At 3:20 p.m., a V-2 rocket struck the roof of the cinema. The building collapsed instantly. The structural failure trapped hundreds under the rubble. Rescue operations lasted a week. The toll, 567 lives lost. Among them were 296 Allied soldiers. One strike, nearly 600 lives. But the rockets left traces, not just in the form of craters. They left traces in people, literally. The story of Erich Horn is a vivid example. In 1944, he was 14 years old, living in London. When a rocket struck near his home, the blast threw him across the room. He survived, battered, but alive. He lived a long life, moved to Australia, became a policeman. And only in 2021, at the age of 92, did he notice a lump on his cheek. He used tweezers and removed a tiny piece of metal. Experts identified it. The markings on the aluminum fragment confirmed it was part of a V-2 rocket condenser. Erich Horn had carried a piece of the weapon in his body for 77 years. It is a reminder that war doesn't end when treaties are signed. fragments remain in the ground, in memory, and in the bodies of survivors. But let's look at the cold, hard facts. Despite the tragedy of the wrecked cinema, despite the fear in London, from a military standpoint, the V2 campaign was a failure. The attacks did not force the Allies to surrender. They only stiffened their resolve. And most importantly, the math of war worked against Germany. They were spending gold bars to break windows. Let's look at war as an economy. You have a limited budget, and you must invest it to inflict maximum damage. From this view, the V2 program was a financial disaster. The cost was astronomical, but the return on investment was negligible. One raid by American B-17 bombers could deliver more explosives in a few hours than the entire V2 program did in 6 months. But bombers were reusable. The V2 was a single-use robot. It's like buying a new luxury car to drive to the store and then burning it in the parking lot. Every single time. And the problem wasn't just cost. It was accuracy. Propaganda called it sniper fire. In reality, it was blind fire. The guidance system was primitive. If the rocket landed within 10 miles of the target, it was considered a success. 10 miles! Imagine aiming at a specific building in New York and hitting an airport in a different borough. That is why they targeted London. London is a giant target on a map. It's hard to miss a city. But to hit a specific factory or military base? Impossible. Historians have calculated the opportunity cost. If Germany hadn't wasted resources on these rockets, they could have built 24,000 fighter jets. In 1944, the Luftwaffe had no planes to protect the sky. 24,000 extra fighters could have challenged the D-Day landings. They could have prolonged the war by years. Instead, the leadership chose the wonder weapon. Why? Because it was a psychological crutch. For a dictator losing control, the rocket was a symbol of power. He didn't need boring efficiency. He needed thunder. By March 1945, the German army was collapsing. The launch units retreated deeper into Germany until they ran out of fuel. The last rocket was launched on March 27, 1945. Thus ended the combat history of the V2, expensive and strategically useless. But as the last rockets cooled in their craters, a different race began. A race not for metal, but for minds. The Allies realized the rocket was a terrible weapon, but a brilliant machine. And now, the hunt was on. Americans, Russians, British, everyone wanted the creators of this miracle. And the main prize was Wernher von Braun. Spring, 1945. Germany is in chaos. On roads clogged with refugees, a strange convoy moves through the Alps. It carries the elite of German science, von Braun's team. Von Braun was pragmatic. He knew the war was lost, but his career didn't have to end. He gathered his top engineers and posed a question. Who do we surrender to? The Soviets? Too dangerous. The British? They had no funding. That left America, a country with unlimited resources, and, von Braun hoped, a pragmatic approach to the past. Before surrendering, they hid their greatest treasure, 14 tons of technical documents, blueprints, formulas, 10 years of data. They sealed them in a mine. This was their insurance policy. On May 2nd, 1945, von Braun's brother approached American soldiers on a bicycle. In broken English, he said a phrase that changed history. "My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender." U.S. intelligence instantly understood what they had. Operation Paperclip began. The goal was simple. Get the scientists to the U.S. before the Soviets could take them. But there was a moral problem. Many of these scientists were deeply involved with the regime. Some were implicated in the harsh treatment of laborers. Legally, they should have faced justice. But the Cold War was beginning. The Pentagon decided these mines were too valuable to lose. In their files, paperclips were attached to their new dossiers, hence the name. New Clean biographies were created. Their past affiliations were minimized. They were presented as victims of circumstance, scientists who had no choice. It was a grand moral compromise. Along with the people, the Americans took the hardware. They cleared out the Mittelwerk factory just days before the Soviet army arrived to take control of the zone. 300 rail cars loaded with parts, engines, and tools. In the summer of 1945, this strange cargo arrived in the New Mexico desert, White Sands proving ground. Here, the German scientists began assembling their rockets again. But now, instead of the old insignias, they painted white stars of the U.S. Army on the fuselages. For American soldiers, it was surreal. Yesterday's enemies were now living in officer quarters, drinking soda, and teaching them how to launch rockets. On April 16, 1946, a captured V-2 blasted off from White Sands, flying higher than any aircraft before it. The generals smiled. They had the weapon of the future. Von Braun adapted quickly. He wrote articles, appeared on TV, and even collaborated with Disney to explain the future of space travel. He sold the American public on the dream of space just as effectively as he had sold the weapon to the generals. He became a hero, the father of the space program. But every time a rocket launched, it trailed an invisible shadow, the shadow of the Mittelwerk tunnels. 20 years later, this man would build the most powerful rocket in history, the Saturn V. It would carry Neil Armstrong to the moon. But if you place the blueprints of the Saturn V next to the yellowed blueprints of the V-2, you see a startling resemblance. You see evolution. The giant pumps feeding fuel into the Saturn engines are direct descendants of the pumps assembled by prisoners in the dark. The stabilization, the nozzles, the very idea of a multi-stage rocket, it was all born there. There is a dark joke attributed to British engineers after the war. The V-2 was a perfectly good rocket. It just landed on the wrong planet. And in that joke lies the entire paradox of our story. As a weapon, the V-2 was a failure. It consumed resources that accelerated Germany's defeat. It cost more lives to build than it took in battle. Strategically, it was a mistake. But as technology, it changed everything. The V-2 became the patient zero of the space age. All modern ballistic missiles, all the satellites that give us GPS and the internet, they are the grandchildren of the V-2. And that small step for man on the moon was made possible by technology developed to destroy London. It is an uncomfortable truth. We want clear lines between good and evil. We want great achievements to come from pure sources. But history is often gray. Wernher von Braun died a respected figure. But the shadow of the past remained. The shadow of 20,000 people who never saw the moon, but paved the road to it with their lives. Today, a surviving V-2 stands in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. It stands quiet. Black and white check pattern. Smooth, cold metal. Tourists walk by, admiring its retro-futuristic design. But if you stand close and listen, you won't hear the roar of an engine. You won't hear an explosion. You will hear silence. The same silence that fell over London a second before impact, and the silence that still fills the abandoned tunnels under the mountain in Germany. Technology is neutral. A rocket is just a machine. It doesn't know if it's flying to destroy a city or to explore the stars. The choice of the target always remains with the person pushing the button. And that is perhaps the most important lesson left to us by the useless rocket. See you in the next video.